You hear the sound first, boots on stone, then the scrape of reed matting torn from its frame. You reach for your children, but hands are already pulling you backward into darkness. Your voice cuts the air once before a shout swallows it whole. Outside, your children press their palms against the wall and listen to what they cannot stop. This is not a story about war. It's about what happens after the battle ends, when the conquerors turn their attention from gold to flesh, when laws are written in one hemisphere and broken in another, when a woman's body becomes the currency of an empire that calls itself Christian. Before we go on, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. It genuinely amazes me that a story buried in colonial archives can reach someone halfway across the world centuries later. What the Spanish did to Inca women after the conquest of the 1530s was documented by their own priests, recorded in royal courts, and left visible in bone. And for many of those women, survival itself became a form of suffering worse than death. The scene repeats across the Andes in the decade following Francisco Pizarro's entry into Cusco in 1533. Spanish soldiers, encomenderos, and settlers move through newly conquered territories with royal grants that parcel out land, labor, and people. Women are listed in these documents not by name, but by function, domestic service, textile production, tribute obligation. The language is bureaucratic. The reality is intimate and violent. Archaeological surveys of household compounds in places like Huanacopampa show abrupt changes after conquest. New male-dominated architecture overlaying indigenous domestic spaces. Personal artifacts disrupted mid-use evidence of hasty abandonment. The conquistadors didn't just occupy land, they occupied homes, and the women inside those homes had nowhere to go. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who witnessed the aftermath, wrote in 1552 of what he called the systematic degradation of indigenous women by men who claimed to bring salvation. He didn't use euphemisms. He described forced cohabitation, sexual slavery disguised as domestic service, and the legal structures that made it possible. His account was not unique. Other chroniclers, Pedro Ciza de Leon, Bernab Cobo, corroborated the same patterns. But here's the paradox that haunts this story. Spain had laws protecting indigenous women. The laws of Burgos in 1512, revised ordinances in the 1530s, repeated royal decrees from Charles V commanding humane treatment and prohibiting abuse. On paper, the Spanish crown attempted to regulate its settlers. In practice, enforcement was an ocean away, and local power brokers ignored what they could not profit from. So the law became a fiction, and the fiction became a trap. Because when a woman appealed to a colonial court for protection, she entered a system designed by the men who had violated her in the first place. Let's follow one thread through the archive. In the 1540s, a series of petitions appear in the audiencia records of Cusco legal complaints filed by indigenous women, often with the help of a translator or sympathetic priest. One case, preserved in notarial minutes, involves a woman identified only as Ana. She brings a complaint against a Spanish encomendero who had taken her from her household after her husband was conscripted into the Meta labor draft. She lived in his compound for 2 years. She bore a child. He never married her, never acknowledged the child, and when she asked for maintenance, basic support, to feed the baby, he had her removed from his property. Ana's petition asks for a dowry, for recognition of the child's paternity, for the encomendero to be compelled into Christian marriage or to provide compensation. The case drags on for months. Witnesses testify the encomendero claims the relationship was consensual and that Ana was a servant, not a spouse. The judge, a Spanish official appointed by the crown, rules in favor of the encomendero on the grounds that no formal marriage contract existed and that indigenous women were not entitled to the same dowry protections as Spanish women under Castilian law. Ana's file ends there. We don't know what happened to her or her child, but her case was not unusual. It was standard. The colonial legal system created a space where sexual exploitation could be contested but rarely punished, where women could speak but were seldom heard, where justice was a performance that almost always ended in dismissal. And so women learned to navigate a different system: survival, negotiation, silence, or when possible, escape. But escape required resources, kin networks, or the protection of the church, and the church itself was complicit in more ways than one. Missionaries played a contradictory role. Figures like Las Casas, genuinely advocated for indigenous protections and documented abuses with forensic clarity. But the institutional church also enforced baptism, Christian marriage norms, and moral regulation in ways that stripped women of autonomy. Parish registers from the 1540s onward show a spike in forced baptisms and marriages, arranged not by families but by priests attempting to legitimize relationships that had begun as coercion. The church sought to impose order on what it saw as moral chaos. In doing so, it often reinforced the power of Spanish men over indigenous women, just under a Christian label. And then there were the A class, the chosen women of the Inca state, an institution that predated conquest. These were women selected in childhood for service in temples, for textile production, and sometimes as diplomatic brides for Inca nobles. They lived in controlled compounds called acloasi, spaces of both privilege and restriction. When the Spanish arrived, they encountered the A-class with fascination and entitlement. Chronicles describe conquistadors seizing A-class after the fall of Cusco, baptizing them, and incorporating them into Spanish households as wives if they were lucky, as concubines if they were not, as servants in either case. Excavations of acloasi sites reveal something haunting: continuity in textile tools and production layouts, but a sudden change in the destination of goods and the identity of overseers. The looms kept working. The hands that worked them were the same, but the product and the profit now belonged to Spanish masters. The A-class, once protected by the Inca state's elaborate hierarchy, became just another resource to be extracted. Bioarchaeology adds another layer of testimony. Studies of skeletal remains from colonial period cemeteries near Cusco and Trujillo show markers of chronic stress in female skeletons, enamel hypoplasia indicating childhood malnutrition, cribra orbitalia from anemia, healed fractures consistent with interpersonal violence. Isotopic analysis of bones reveals dietary shifts. Women who once had access to high-protein foods like maize and quinoa show patterns consistent with reduced caloric intake and increased labor after conquest. These are not subjective accounts. They are chemical signatures written in bone, showing that the violence was not only sexual, and the violence escalated with epidemic disease. Smallpox, measles, and typhus swept the Andes in waves beginning in the 1520s, killing an estimated 50 to 90% of the indigenous population over the course of a century. The demographic collapse created orphans, widows, and social disintegration. Women who might once have been protected by extended kin networks found themselves alone. Spanish settlers exploited that vulnerability systematically. Colonial censuses and tribute lists document skewed sex ratios in certain villages, more women than men, the men having died in epidemics or been taken for labor. Women became targets not only for sexual exploitation, but for forced relocation into reducciones, concentrated settlements where the Spanish could monitor, tax, and control them more easily. Imagine surviving a plague that killed your parents, your husband, your brothers. You are left with your children in a village that has lost half its people. Then soldiers arrive with orders to relocate you to a new town under the oversight of a Spanish administrator and a priest. You are promised protection, Christianization, and integration into the colonial economy. What you get is a labor draft, a household assignment to a Spanish settler, and no legal recourse when that settler decides you owe him more than labor. This is the structure that replaced the Inca state. Not chaos, but a different kind of order. One designed to extract as much value as possible from the colonized, and for women, that value included their bodies. Yet resistance existed. It just took forms that are harder to see in the archive. Indigenous communities filed collective petitions against abuses, invoking pre-conquest rights and appealing to the Crown's stated ideals. Some of these petitions survive, often written in formal Spanish by a literate intermediary, but bearing the marks of communal authorship. They describe specific harms, women taken from homes, children fathered and abandoned, tribute demands that left families starving. A few petitions resulted in investigations. Rarely did they result in punishment, but the act of filing mattered. It created a record. It asserted that what was happening was not normal, not acceptable, not what the law promised. Women also resisted through the church. Some sought sanctuary in convents or missions, places where Spanish authority was mediated by religious vows. Hospital records and charitable institution logs show indigenous and mestiza women admitted for refuge, for childbirth, or after violence. These institutions were imperfect. They imposed Christianity, regulated behavior, and rarely challenged the broader colonial system. But for some women, they were the only alternative to a life of unprotected servitude, and some women negotiated power. Not all relationships between Spanish men and indigenous women were purely coercive. Some women formed strategic alliances, securing dowries, property, and recognition for their children. Notarial archives preserve cases of indigenous and mestiza women who successfully sued for inheritance, who leveraged their children's mixed status for social mobility, who married into Creole families and gained legal protections. These cases were exceptions, not the rule. But they reveal something important. Even within a brutal system, women exercised agency where they could. Survival required intelligence, endurance, and an ability to navigate between two worlds. Speaking the language of Spanish law while maintaining ties to indigenous communities, the children born of these unions, mestizos, became a demographic and social reality that the colonial system struggled to categorize. Baptismal registers from Lima, Arequipa, and Cusco in the mid-16th century show an explosion of mixed ancestry births. Some fathers acknowledged paternity. Many did not. Spanish law treated legitimate and illegitimate children differently, granting inheritance and status only to those formally recognized. The result was a generation of children whose social position depended entirely on the whims of their fathers. For the mothers, this created another layer of vulnerability. Their children's futures were hostage to men who had already demonstrated their willingness to discard indigenous women once they served their purpose. By the 17th century, colonial society had calcified into a caste system that codified these inequalities. Casta paintings, vivid colonial artworks that categorized people by racial ancestry, depicted mestizos, mulattoes, and other mixed groups in a hierarchy that placed Spanish-born peninsulares at the top and indigenous people near the bottom. Women's legal rights, marriage prospects, and even their testimony in court were determined by their place in this system. A Spanish woman's word carried weight. An indigenous woman's did not, and a mestiza existed in between, her status contingent and contested. The economic system reinforced these patterns. Fiscal records and colonial cadastral surveys revealed that settlers had financial incentives to maintain access to indigenous labor and to consolidate households that included indigenous women for domestic production. Textile production, a major economic output, relied heavily on women's labor. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and textile fragments found in colonial contexts attest to women's central role. The material record shows that economic systems created incentives for settlers to control indigenous women's labor and reproductive capacities. This economic motive helps explain why laws against abuse were often ineffective. Profit and power aligned against protection. The municipal level offers another view of how exploitation was maintained. Cabildo minutes records, kept by town councils, show local elites contesting royal directives when enforcement threatened local power. These documents reveal a political economy where local governance often shielded settlers from metropolitan law. Colonial towns accumulated wealth while indigenous neighborhoods were dispossessed. The tension between central law and local reality meant that women's prospects for justice depended less on what the law said and more on who controlled its enforcement. Yet even in this system, traces of women's voices survive. Guamon Pama de Ayala, an indigenous chronicler, produced a 1,200-page manuscript in the early 17th century filled with illustrations and complaints about colonial abuses. His text includes graphic accounts of violence against women and petitions for justice. It serves as a primary indigenous voice documenting the systematic nature of exploitation. Other testimonies appear in ecclesiastical court records, where women brought cases against abusers or sought to compel marriage. These documents are fragmentary, filtered through interpreters and legal language. But they preserve something vital, the insistence that what was happening mattered, that it was wrong, that someone needed to listen. The long-term consequence was not only personal suffering, but the embedding of gendered and racialized violence into the foundations of colonial society. The same structures that allowed sexual exploitation in the 1530s persisted, adapted, and became institutional norms that survived into the independence era and beyond. When Latin American countries gained independence in the 19th century, the legal codes they adopted retained many colonial assumptions about women, property, and race. The Republic of Peru did not grant equal rights to indigenous women. It inherited the hierarchies Spain had built. So when we say what the Spanish did to Inca women was worse than death, we mean this: death ends. But the structures of exploitation, the legal erasure, the social dislocation, the loss of bodily autonomy, the denial of protection, the weaponization of law and religion against the vulnerable, those things persist across generations. They shape who gets remembered and who gets forgotten, whose suffering is recorded and whose is erased. The archaeological record forces us to remember the bones don't lie, the stress fractures, the dietary collapse, the shifts in settlement patterns, the mass graves. They testify to a violence that was systematic, sustained, and sanctioned by the institutions meant to regulate it. And the archives, despite their biases, preserve voices that demand to be heard. Women like Anna, who brought her complaint to a court that dismissed her, still left a trace. Her name, her child, her refusal to disappear quietly. They survived in the notarial record. Waiting for historians to read them, not as footnotes, but as testimony, modern efforts to memorialize this history face a difficult question. How do you honor the dead without turning their suffering into spectacle? Repatriation projects in Peru have returned skeletal remains to indigenous communities for museums have begun to include interpretive panels that name what happened as violence, not as cultural encounter. Descendant communities have demanded consultation and control over how their ancestors' remains and stories are displayed. These efforts are acts of repair, incomplete and imperfect, but necessary. Because the truth is this: the Spanish did not conquer the Inca Empire with swords alone. They conquered it with laws that created categories of human beings who could be owned. With a church that sanctified domination, with economic systems that made violence profitable, and with a willingness to ignore the suffering of women whose bodies became the terrain on which empire was built. And the women who survived, who bore children, who filed petitions, who wove textiles in captivity, who carried their languages and memories into a world that tried to erase them, they are the reason we can tell this story at all. They left marks in bone and ink in the children who inherited their resilience. In the quiet refusals documented in legal files, they were not passive, they were not silent. They were forced into a world that gave them almost no power, and they used what little they had to survive and resist. That is not a happy ending, it's just the truth. And the truth is what they deserve. The reed partition is torn open. The children listen from outside, and centuries later, we listen to not because the story is easy, but because forgetting would be worse.